All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking back at August 21st, 1976, to unpack one of the most dramatic and, frankly, bizarre peacetime shows of military force in United States history. Now, this isn't your typical story about invading a country or toppling a regime. Instead, we're going to look at how a totally mundane landscaping task somehow escalated into an operation that put the entire planet right on the brink of war. Today, we're breaking down exactly how and why this wild event happened.
813. Let that number sink in for a second. That is the exact number of heavily armed men mobilized for this one specific operation. But it wasn't just guys on the ground. This massive mobilization was backed by an absolutely mind-blowing array of military hardware. We're talking fighter jets, attack helicopters, heavily armored trucks, and, if you can believe it, an entire aircraft carrier battle group stationed just off the coast. The sheer scale of this assembly for a peacetime operation is literally staggering.
And honestly, that brings us to the central mystery we're unpacking today. Why on earth would you spend millions of dollars in jet fuel and mobilize an entire armada just to, well, annoy a plant? It sounds like a joke, right? But this was a deadly serious military operation, and it's an incredible case study in geopolitics. It really goes to show how the absolute smallest incident can threaten the stability of the entire globe.
Okay, moving into Section 1, an army for a tree, the bizarre mobilization.
The sheer absurdity of the target here is really what makes this story so fascinating. The objective for all of that overwhelming military might, it was a single 40-foot-tall poplar tree. And if you know anything about wood, poplar is actually one of the softest hardwoods out there. It's not exactly an impenetrable fortress. Yet, for the United States military, this one 40-foot piece of wood became a reason to nearly trigger a second Korean War. The contrast between this soft tree and the incredibly hard military response is just unreal.
Section 2. The DMZ powder keg. High tensions, weird rules. To really understand why this happened, we have to talk about the geography of this tension. Created back in 1953, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, is basically a 2.5-mile wide buffer zone separating North and South Korea. But tucked inside this buffer is the Joint Security Area, the JSA. It's a tiny village where troops from both sides literally just stand around glaring at each other all day. The stakes in this confined space were incredibly high. One wrong move, even a misunderstood gesture, could theoretically trigger a world-ending catastrophe.
So, on paper, you've got these incredibly strict JSA rules. Basically, no heavy weapons or guns allowed. It makes sense, right? You want to prevent some accidental crossfire from spiraling into World War III. But the reality on the ground? Oh man, it was a totally different story. Because of these no-gun rules, the tension had absolutely nowhere to go. It constantly boiled over into brutal, hand-to-hand brawls. Soldiers were literally settling disputes by fighting with sticks, breaking each other's arms and kicking each other in the throats. It was peace on paper, sure, but absolute violence in practice.
Because they were operating in this bizarre, weaponless combat environment, the United States had to get creative with its strategy. Without heavy weapons to project their power, the military leaned heavily on pure physical intimidation. Their official policy? Any soldier sent to the JSA had to be at least 6 feet tall. The logic is so simple but so striking. If you can't carry an assault rifle, well, the next best tactical advantage is the sheer confidence and imposing physical presence of a very tall American man.
Which brings us to Section 3, the axe murder incident. Trimming turns tragic.
So, how exactly does a routine bit of landscaping turn deadly in a powder keg like this? Let's trace how fast this escalated. It all kicks off on August 19th. That poplar tree we talked about was actually blocking the line of sight between 2 United Nations command checkpoints. So a work crew of 10 very tall Americans and 5 South Koreans heads out to simply trim the branches. No big deal, right? Well, they're immediately met by about 15 North Korean soldiers who demand they stop the trimming right then and there. Their reason? They claim that North Korean leader Kim Il-sung had personally planted that exact tree.
Now the US and South Korean trimming crew, they decide to ignore those initial demands and just keep on working, and that prompted an immediate massive escalation. About 20 more North Korean troops suddenly rushed the scene, and they are definitely not empty-handed. They brought crowbars and clubs, and worse yet, explicit orders were given by the North Koreans right then to, quote, kill the tree cutters.
In a short, horrifyingly brutal fight, the whole situation shifted in the blink of an eye from a tense verbal standoff into a complete tragedy. When the dust finally settled, 2 American soldiers lay dead. And the really chilling part? They were murdered by the opposing forces using the crew's very own tree trimming tools. The absolute unthinkable had just happened in the most delicate buffer zone on Earth.
Let's look at Section 4, Operation Paul Bunyan, a calculated retaliation. With American blood spilled inside the JSA, the United States absolutely had to respond. The plan they cooked up became known as Operation Paul Bunyan, and this quote from President Gerald Ford really captures the insanely delicate tightrope they were walking. He ordered a retaliation that was, in his exact words, just short of a war. The mandate here was to send a loud, crystal-clear message to Kim Il-sung. The United States is not messing around and will not tolerate these murders. But, and this is the tricky part, they had to pull this off without actually sparking a full-blown global conflict. Visually, the overwhelming force that appeared over the horizon on August 21st was just staggering. To guard this tree trimming op, the U.S. brought in an absolutely massive airborne arsenal. We are talking AH-1 Cobra gunships, massive B-52 Stratofortresses, F-11 fighter bombers, and dozens of F-4 Phantom jets, all just swarming the sky. Oh, and just off the coast, a fully operational aircraft carrier battle group was waiting. They essentially put a world-class air force on standby, all focused entirely on a single tree.
And down on the ground, the tactical choices were just as fascinating. The actual job of cutting the tree fell to a team of just 16 engineers. And here's a crazy detail. They intentionally used chainsaws instead of heavy, cumbersome logging equipment. Why? Because a chainsaw is way easier to drop fast if a firefight suddenly breaks out. Guarding them were 60 South Korean special forces carrying pistols and axe handles. And just to make absolutely sure they were ready for the worst, the convoy trucks that rolled in were rigged with hidden claymore mines stuffed underneath sandbags. Literally every detail was calculated for rapid escalation if things went south.
Now, to back up the engineers, the jets, and the special forces, the U.S. military took one more massive step. All 41,000 United States troops stationed across the entirety of Korea were simultaneously bumped up to DEFCON 3 alert status. The entire military apparatus in the region was cocked and ready to fire, the whole shebang.
So, what actually happened when the chainsaws fired up? Well, when the hundreds of North Korean troops stationed at the JSA looked up and saw this dizzying, overwhelming wall of American military hardware bearing down on them, they wisely made the decision to stand down. For 40 tense minutes, the engineers worked, and without a single shot being fired by either side, that 40-foot tree was swiftly reduced to a 20-foot-tall stump.
Finally, Section 5, a world war avoided, the geopolitical aftermath.
Thankfully, everyone walked away from Operation Paul Bunyan unharmed. The global days since a World War ticker kept right on climbing. And the show of force was actually so effective that Kim Il-sung issued a highly unusual, super rare statement of regret regarding the murders of those American soldiers. Today, that infamous poplar stump has been replaced by a memorial to the fallen men. And as a direct result of this extreme enforcement of boundaries, the JSA became slightly more peaceful, or at the very least, a little less prone to wild hand-to-hand combat.
I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. When a simple act of landscaping, literally just trimming a tree to clear a line of sight, requires a DEFCON 3 military response, an aircraft carrier, B-52 bombers, and 813 troops just to avoid a war, what does that truly say about the razor-thin line between global stability and total chaos? It's a pretty striking reminder of how fragile the illusion of peace can be in the world's most heavily guarded borders. Definitely keep that in mind the next time you think about the quiet tension of the DMZ.